Welcome everybody this morning to the Festival Centre. Wan Yin Ge Wei. It's wonderful to see you all here. And it's particularly gratifying again to be working with our close partners, the Confucius Institute and Mobo Gao, Professor Mobo Gao. This is a long partnership that we have been involved in over many years. Pretty much when we established the OzAsia Festival 8 years ago, the Confucius Institute has been a consistent and innovative partner for us because, as you would understand, a lot of the work that we do with OzAsia Festival is very much focused on Chinese culture. This year it's of particular significance given the showcasing of our sister province Shandong, and given the fact that Shandong is the birthplace of Confucius. And we have distinguished guest here today, and indeed a relative of Confucius. But in the work that we have done in putting this OzAsia Festival together, and this symposium, and the work with Shandong province, I'm very pleased to say that the Confucius Institute has been an absolute prime player and partner in that activity. I'm also very pleased to say that some of you will know that we signed a new memorandum of understanding last week while the Vice Governor of Shandong was here for continued cultural relations and exchange between our sister province Shandong and Adelaide in South Australia. And after this fantastic event where the Shandong Cultural Department clearly invested very strongly in OzAsia Festival, we will now look to take South Australian artists to Shandong next year. But even more importantly, there is now in place an internship program to bring young Shandong arts administrators to our cultural institutions here over a 3 to 4 year period. So that will mean this centre, it will mean the gallery, it will mean the museum, etc., etc. And indeed, in time, we're hoping to send Mandarin-speaking arts administrators from South Australia to Shandong. But that now is in place. It's got support from the state, both state government and the provincial government in Shandong. And of course, we are still knocking on the door of our own federal government, which is a drawn-out process, of course. But anyway, I say all that because there is some continuity here, and that's a really important thing. And at the heart of it, this festival has not only been about performing arts and visual arts, it's about ideas as well, ideas about cultural exchange. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure always to have Mobo and Aaron and other people from the Confucius Institute in the building, and it's also a great pleasure to introduce him now, Professor Mobo Gao.
For those who don't know, my name is Mobo Gao. I'm the director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Adelaide. And today I'm going to make a few opening remarks, and then I'll chair the session. Thank you, Mr. Douglas Kadia and the Adelaide Festival Centre for co-hosting the first World Confucius Forum and providing the beautiful venue. We are doing this forum because for a number of reasons. The first reason is that the Confucius Institute as an institution was initiated by the Chinese government in year 2004. And the first Confucius Institute was set up in South Korea in 2004. The formula is that the Chinese government would provide some funding to set up a Confucius Institute in a university in various countries. And Adelaide University set up its Confucius Institute in the year 2007, and the first, one of the 14 at the moment in Australia. And so the institution of Confucius Institute has a 10-year anniversary this year. So we hold this forum to celebrate that. But also, as we know, this year's Adelaide Festival focuses on Shandong province. As Douglas just mentioned, Shandong, especially Chifu, is the birthplace of Confucius. And also, very importantly, there is a rise of Confucianism in China. And we want to address this issue. Actually, we want to address three issues today. One is, why is there a rise of Confucianism in China? For those who know a little of the history of China, you would realize, you all know that ever since towards the end of the 19th century, Confucianism has been the target of criticism. The Chinese hold Confucianism as responsible for China's backwardness. And they say Confucianism is fatalistic. It's benighted in its enlightenment. But why there's a rise of Confucianism since the 1990s? This is the first issue. The second issue, what is Confucianism? What are the core values of Confucianism? And I hope the speakers will bring that out to the audience. And finally, the third issue is, what does it mean to us? Australia in particular and people in the West. What does the rise of Confucianism imply or impact on our life? Again, I hope the speakers will bring that out. Now we have 5 distinguished speakers, and 3 of them from China. And one of them is actually the 75th generation of Confucius descendant. I know there's English, there's a program, a TV program in Australia, Who Do You Think You Are? Right? And these famous, well-known people are trying to trace their ancestors back to England and so on. But I would be very, very surprised if any of these people can trace their ancestors back to 75 generations. The second speaker is also from Shandong province, who is well known for talking about Neo-Confucianism. See, one of the reasons why Confucianism is revival and is relevant to today is that you can reinterpret Confucianism and apply it to today's life. And one of the things they can do is called Neo-Confucianism. And the third speaker is Professor Fu De, and who was speaking here last night. And he was talking about the relevance of Judaism, or the Jewish reform of adopting modern life while at the same time maintaining the traditional values. So Professor Fu was trying to argue that the Chinese can do the same by learning from the Jewish people. So you can make China a modern state, adopting Western values like freedom, democracy, equality. At the same time, can maintain some core values of Confucianism. And the fourth speaker is Professor Roland Boer. He's from University of Newcastle. And again, Professor Boer is going to give us a very stimulating, interesting talk, because he is trying to match, I think, I haven't seen his draft or anything yet. I'm not going to censor that. It's about Marxism or Mao Zedong's ideas with the Confucius. That'll be very, very, very stimulating. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Mr. Reg Little, who was a former diplomat and who has a whole lot of experiences in Asia in language, and also is responsible for some Confucian revival in China. Now, I'll give a little bit more details of each speaker later. Now, the format is we get a speaker to speak, and sometimes please be a little bit patient, because we have speakers who speak in Chinese and we have people to translate for you. I know it's not ideal, but also you also know not everybody speaks all the languages. I'm sure the audience here, you don't speak Chinese, some of you, right? So it is quite understandable some speakers don't speak English fluently enough, so therefore we need translation. So you have to bear with us if the translation is a little bit time consuming. And after each speaker, I'll try to interpret what they say and then introduce the next speaker. And after that, when the speaker is finished speaking, we're going to have a break. We can have tea and talk, and then come back, we have the Q&A session. So here we go. The first speaker is Professor Kong Xianling. And as I said, he is the descendant, the 5th generation of Confucius. And he's specialized in, as you can imagine, the family history and the temples of Confucius worldwide. And his topic today is the value of Confucianism in contemporary China. Please welcome Professor Kong.
最近的主任先生、院长先生、各位女士、各位先生，上午好。
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is my honor to present my presentation here.
刚才院长介绍了，我的名字叫孔祥林，是孔子的第75代孙。
Just now, the director had already introduced me. I'm the 75th descendant of Confucius.
大家可能觉得孔子2000多年了，75代是怎么查出来的？是不是假冒的？
Probably you will doubt whether I'm really the descendant of Confucius or not, because he has already been dead for so many years.
我们这个家族呢，这名字呢是3个字，中间这个字就是你是多少代，都是统一的。
Our names have 3 characters, and in the middle it is about the generation of Confucius.
我中间的那个祥就是75代，如果你再碰到叫孔祥什么的，毫无疑问他也是75代。
The character Xiang means that I'm the 75th descendant of Confucius. If you meet any other person who is also called Kong Xiang, then you can guess he's also the 75th descendant of Confucius.
别人想混也混不进去，因为我们有这个严格的管理体系，也有家谱。
So nobody can just mess around and pretend to be the descendant of Confucius, because we have strict family relationship.
我们的家谱呢是60年一次修。
Our family tree will be amended every 60 years.
2009年最近刚修成的这一个家谱呢，摞起来有这么高，2.2米。
The latest family building constructed in 2009 is very tall.
好吧，外传太多了，现在转入主题，就是我发言的题目是儒学在当代中国的价值。
Now I would like to move on to my speech. The topic is my speech is the value of Confucianism in contemporary China.
2012年的时候呢，习近平主席提出了实现中华文大复兴的中国梦。在一系列的讲话当中呢，他都提出了要弘扬传统思想文化。
In 2012, President Xi Jinping had proposed the Chinese dream of great national rejuvenation, and in a series of speeches given by him, he also stressed the dream of the Chinese dream.
去年的11月，他曾经呢专门到曲阜去做了一次考察，主持了一个座谈会。
In November last year, he made a special visit to Qufu and held a colloquium there.
非常有幸，我也能参加了这次座谈。
It was my great honor that I was present there.
在这次会议上呢，习近平就提出来呢，要大力弘扬传统思想文化。
At that colloquium, President Xi Jinping proposed that we should cultivate and carry forward Chinese culture.
中国有的学者认为呢，它的意义是非常重大的。
Chinese scholars think that it is of great importance to carry forward and.
它的意义呢，不次于1992年邓小平关于到南方视察的一个关于进一步开放的那个讲话。
It is based on the speech given by Deng Xiaoping in the South China in 1992.
人们好像觉得一夜之间，怎么中国又开始回归传统了，要重视传统文化了。其实呢，这是这些年以来，是中国一直慢慢向传统回归的一个阶段。
People thought that it seems that overnight people began to care about traditional Chinese culture once again, and actually in recent years we have a tendency to pay more attention to traditional Chinese culture.
在80年的时候呢，邓小平就提出呢是五讲四美三热爱，就在中国呢就搞起了一个很重大的活动。
In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping proposed 5 stresses and 4 beauty, so for Chinese people to follow.
2001年的时候呢，江泽民呢就提出来要把依法治国和依德治国呢结合起来。
In January 2001, Jiang Zemin proposed to continue the rule of virtue and the rule of law.
2005年呢，胡锦涛就提出了建设和谐社会和和谐世界的主张。
In 2005, Hu Jintao proposed to establish the harmonious society.
2006年呢，他又提出建设社会主义的核心价值思想体系。
In 2006, Hu Jintao proposed to establish a core value system.
2012年呢，是习近平提出来实现中华民族的伟大复兴的中国梦。
In 2012, Xi Jinping put forth the Chinese dream of achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
所以从这些可以看出呢，改革开放以来，中国世代的领导人都在不断的从传统思想文化当中汲取营养。
From this, we can see that the 4 generations of Chinese leaders have drawn on a lot of traditional Chinese culture.
中国的有特色的社会主义呢，将会带上越来越多的传统思想文化的印记。
The socialist society with special Chinese characteristics will be more influenced by traditional Chinese culture.
江泽民呢是提出了依德治国和依法治国相结合，其实呢这就是借鉴了中国儒家的治国传统。
Jiang Zemin proposed to integrate the rule of law and the rule of virtue. This is based on traditional Chinese culture actually.
2000年的时候，江泽民呢就阐述了法律和道德在国家管理中的作用关系问题。
In 2000, Jiang Zemin talked about the role of law and virtue in national governance.
他说呢，法律与道德呢作为上层建筑的组成部分， 都是维护社会秩序、规范人民思想和行为的重要手段。它们互相联系、互相补充。法治呢是以其权威性和强势手段规范社会成员的行为，而德治呢是以其说服力和劝导力提高社会成员的思想认识和道德觉悟。
As components of superstructure, law and virtue are important means of maintaining social order, regulate people's thoughts and behavior. They are mutually related and complementary. Rule of law is to regulate the behavior of social members by forceful means, and rule of virtue is to educate people through their moral and ethical education.
所以他说呢，这个道德规范和法律规范应该是互相结合，来统一发挥作用。
He said that moral and legal regulations should be integrated in order to better rule our country.
所以他主张呢，要这个坚持不懈地加强社会主义法治建设，依法治国。同时呢，要坚持不懈地坚持这个社会主义的道德建设，以德治国。对于一个国家的治理来说，法治和德治从来都是相辅相成的。
So he proposed that we should make unremitting efforts to strengthen socialist legitimate construction and rule the country by law. He also proposed that we should endeavor to strengthen socialist moral construction and rule the country by means of virtue.
他说，二者呢是互相促进的，二者呢缺一不可，也不可偏废。
They are mutually complementary and promoting, so we cannot neglect any of them.
所以他主张呢，我们要把法治建设与道德建设呢紧密结合起来，把以法治国与以德治国紧密结合起来。
So he proposed that we should integrate legitimate construction and moral construction and integrate rule of law and rule of virtue.
其实呢，以德治国和依法治国呢，就是中国的传统。
Actually, rule of virtue and rule of law are tradition of China.
因为孔子呢就主张呢是德治、法治和礼治三结合的一种治理国家的方式。
Because Confucius thinks that rule of virtue and rule of law and rule of propriety are the tradition of national governance of China.
孔子呢曾经这样说，他说：“道之以政，齐之以刑，民免而无耻；道之以德，齐之以礼，有耻且格。”
Confucius once remarked that if people are led by laws and uniformity is taught by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment but have no sense of shame.
所以在这个孔子思想的影响下呢，中国一直是坚持以德治国、依法治国和以礼治国相结合的这种治国方式。
Influenced by Confucius' thoughts, China has always stick to the idea of law of virtue, rule of virtue, rule of law, and rule of propriety.
以德治国呢，主要是对人民进行思想教化，它没有这个强制性，是软的。
Rule of virtue is to conduct moral teaching, which is very gentle and not mandatory.
依法治国呢，法律是强制性的，强迫人民必须接受，否则呢就会受到惩罚，它是硬的。
Rule of law is, however, very forceful and mandatory.
而礼呢，正好介于两者之间。它礼仪规范呢，它没有法律的强制性，但是呢，它有社会舆论的监督。所以呢，礼呢，它是约束人民行为的一个外在的规范。
Therefore, rule of propriety is between rule of virtue and rule of law. Propriety is external regulation of people's behavior, which is not mandatory but supported by the public.
所以中国人呢，古代就是以德治心，以礼治行，以法呢来惩治犯罪。应该说呢，中国传统的这种德治、礼治、法治三结合的治理方式呢，是非常科学的。
Therefore, in ancient China, we always unite people with virtue, their behavior with propriety, and address crime through law. We should say that these three ways of national governance are very scientific.
这个就是胡锦涛提出的呢，建设和谐社会。其实呢，他是借鉴了儒家的这个社会理念。
This shows how Hu Jintao proposed the establishment of a harmonious society. Actually, it is based on Confucian ideas.
2005年，胡锦涛提出了建设社会主义的和谐社会和和谐世界的主张。
In 2005, Hu Jintao proposed the idea of establishing a harmonious socialist society and harmonious world.
他说呢，我们要建设的社会主义和谐社会，应该是民主法治、公平正义、诚信友善、充满活力、安定有序、人与自然和谐相处的社会。
He said that the harmonious world we would build is one characterized by democracy and rule of law, fairness and justice, honesty and friendship, vitality, stability, orderliness, and harmonious coexistence between the human race and nature.
这个在这一年呢，胡锦涛在美国的耶鲁大学的演讲当中呢，提出了建设和谐世界的主张。
In a speech given at Yale University, he proposed the idea of establishing a harmonious world.
他说，中国呢坚持实施互利共赢的开放战略，真诚愿意同各国人广泛开展合作，真诚愿意兼收并蓄，博采各种文明之长，以合作谋和平，以合作促发展，以推动建设一个持久和平、共同繁荣的和谐世界。
He said that China always upholds an open strategy of mutual benefit and win-win results, hopes to cooperate with all countries and wishes to learn from foreign countries and civilization to pursue peace and development through cooperation.
其实这个和谐世界和这个和谐社会，这个呢，都是借鉴了孔子的这个理念。
Actually, both harmonious world and harmonious society, these two concepts draw on Confucian thoughts.
孔子呢是主张建设和谐社会的。
Confucius advocates a harmonious society.
他的最高的政治理想呢，就是大同社会。在这个社会当中呢，没有压迫，没有剥削，人与人之间平等，互相关爱，是一个人人为公的、天下为公的一个美好的社会。
Confucius advocates the highest level of grand union. His political idea is a stateless world with people caring for each other and loving each other.
他提出的这个少差一点的这个理想呢，就是小康社会。在这个社会当中呢，虽然有了不平等，但是呢，有礼仪规范，有社会制度来约束人民的行为，也是一个和谐有序的社会。
It is reflected in the idea of a moderately prosperous society. Although people may still meet injustice, but they can be enjoy harmonious life because of virtue and social systems.
这个为了实现这和谐社会呢，孔子提出了一个主张，就叫做和而不同。
To realize this dream of a harmonious society, Confucius proposed the idea of harmony in diversity.
孔子说呢，是君子和而不同，小人同而不和。他的意思就是说呢，君子呢只有这个是和谐的，但不是一致的；但是小人呢是一致的，但他并不是和谐的。
According to him, gentlemen are usually harmonious but not always the same. But those mean people, they look the same, but they are actually oppositional to each other.
和呢是多种因素的统一与和谐，是在综合了不同意见之上的和谐与一致，是允许不同意见存在的和谐与协调。
Harmony is the harmony of multiple elements. It is the harmonious state of different ideas and opinions.
在对外方面呢，孔子是反对战争的，他主张的是远人不服，则修文德以来之。远处的人不宾服，应该是提高自己的文化，提高自己的教育，这个教化，提高民族的品质素养，让远处的人主动来投奔，不要去军事征服。
In terms of foreign policy, Confucius proposed that for people from afar, we should not wage wars against them. We should win over them by enhancing our culture, literacy, and our moral standards.
其实中国历史呢是有遵循了孔子这种和而不同建设和谐社会的这个主张的。
China has always followed his proposal.
中国呢虽然从汉代开始，孔子思想呢作为国家的指导思想，但是孔子思想呢是一个包容的思想。
It is our country's guiding principle, and it is a very inclusive principle.
儒家思想呢和其他的思想文化都是和平相处的。
Confucianism is in peaceful coexistence with other traditional Chinese principles.
对其他的宗教，包括中国传统的道教，外来的像佛教、伊斯兰教，后期的天主教、基督教等等，都是主张的是包容相处的。
It proposes peaceful coexistence, just as Taoist Buddhism, Islam and Catholicism.
所以在中国历史上呢，没有发生过宗教战争。
Therefore, in Chinese history, we haven't met any religious wars.
在当代的这个中国呢，也是主张中国接受了、延续了中国的这个治国的传统。
In contemporary China, we also follow this rule of national governance.
所以在这个2002年的时候呢，江泽民在美国演讲的时候呢，就提出，孔子提出的和而不同的思想，和谐而又不千篇一律，不同而又不相互冲突，和谐以共生共长，不同以相辅相成。
In 2002, Jiang Zemin made a speech, and he said that Confucius proposed the idea of harmony in diversity. It embodies the idea of harmony without uniformity and difference without opposition.
和而不同呢，是社会事务和社会文明发展，和社会发展的一条重要的规律，也是人民处事行事应该遵循的准则，是人类多种文明发展的真谛。
Harmony in diversity is an important role of addressing social affairs and developing social relationships. It is also a principle for people to follow in their daily life and the essence of the development of human civilizations.
2013年12月，中国总理温家宝呢，在美国的哈佛大学的演讲当中呢，也提出，和而不同是中国古代思想家提出一个伟大的思想，用和而不同的观点观察问题、处理问题，不仅有利于我们善待邻邦，也有利于国际社会化解矛盾。
In December 2012, when Prime Minister Wen Jiabao made a speech at Harvard University, he said that harmony in diversity is a great idea proposed by Asian Chinese thinkers. From the perspective of harmony in diversity can help us improve our relationship with our neighboring countries and help us address social conflicts.
所以，中国政府呢是主张将和而不同作为处理国际关系的准则。
So Chinese government think that appreciate the principle to address international relationships.
第三方面呢，就是建设社会主义核心价值体系，其实呢也是在汲取儒家的伦理精华。
The third aspect I'm going to talk is to establish a socialist core value system. It is also based on the essence of Confucian ethics.
2006年的时候，中国共产党中央委员会制定了关于构建社会主义和谐社会若干重大问题的这个决定。
In 2006, the Communist Party of China proposed the decision on building a harmonious society.
在决定当中呢，就明确地提出建设社会主义核心价值体系，形成全民族奋发向上的精神力量和团结和睦的精神纽带。
The decision stated that we should establish a socialist core value system and build the spiritual force for the entire nation to empower.
所以提倡的是弘扬我国传统文化中有利于社会和谐的内容，形成
Advocate patriotism, dedication, integrity and friendship, and foster core value system.
要加强社会公德、职业道德、家庭美德、个人品德教育。
which is generally education of social, professional, and family morals and individual ethics.
弘扬中华的传统美德，弘扬时代新风，推进公民道德建设工程，弘扬真善美，贬斥假丑恶，引导人民自觉履行法律义务、社会责任。
We should promote traditional Chinese culture and cultivate new custom of the era, advance stable moral construction project, educate truth, goodness, and beauty, condemn fraudulence, ugliness, and evil, guide people to honor their legal obligations, sorrow, and family responsibilities.
营造这个劳动光荣，创造伟大的社会氛围。
Create a social atmosphere where labor and creation are respected.
培育自融入、讲正气、做奉献、处和谐的良好风尚。
Foster a good custom that tells pride from shame, emphasizes integrity, encourages sacrifice, and promotes harmony.
其实呢，这个中华民族的精神就是在儒家的思想影响下来形成的。
In fact, the spirit of the Chinese nation comes into being under the influence of Confucianism.
它的内容呢，包括了国家兴亡、媳妇有责的以天下为己任的担当精神。
It includes the idea that every man has a share of responsibility for the fate of his country.
富贵不能淫，贫贱不能移，威武不能屈的大丈夫品格。
We shall not be corrupted by neither riches or not honors, not be led astray by poverty nor humbleness, not be subdued by threats or forces.
不屈不挠、自强不息的人生态度。
The attitude of being self-reliant and making unremitting efforts.
孝悌忠信、礼义廉耻的道德自律。
To be pious and faithful to others, the self-discipline of ourselves.
敬民公敏、勇直独义的工作态度。
The professional ethics of being hardworking and just and courageous and persevering.
人数和会、温良恭让的带有原则。
The principle of being benevolent, forgiving, gentle, and courteous to others.
和而不同的处事原则。
The principle of seeking harmony in diversity.
修文来远的外交政策等等。
To others, to win over others by enhancing our cultural standards and moral standard.
现在呢，我们所大力提倡的社会的核心价值观，包括了富强、民主、文明、和谐、自由、平等、公正、法治、爱国、敬业、诚信、友善。其实呢，大多都是来自儒家的传统伦理。
At present, the core value systems advocated by us include prosperity, democracy, civility and harmony, freedom, equality, justice and rule of law, rule of virtue, patriotism, dedication, integrity, and friendship. In fact, all these ideas originate from traditional Confucianism.
最后一个问题就是中国梦呢，肯定了儒家思想在历史上的作用。
Now let's move on to the last question. The Chinese dream that recognizes the historical role of Confucianism.
2012年，习近平提出了中国梦的这个设想。
In 2012, President Xi Jinping proposed the idea of a Chinese dream.
他说，实现中华民族的伟大复兴，就是中华民族近代以来最伟大的梦想。
He said that to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the greatest dream of the nation since modern times.
实现中华民族伟大复兴的中国梦，就是要实现国家富强、民族振兴、人民幸福，这个共同享有人生出彩的机会。
To realize the Chinese dream is to achieve national prosperity, rejuvenation and happiness, and make sure that everyone has the access to a wonderful life.
在2013年6月，他在会见美国记者的时候呢，就进一步的阐释了中国梦。
In June 2013, he elaborated this idea.
中国梦呢是要实现国家富强、民族复兴、人民幸福，是和平发展、合作共赢的梦， 与包括美国梦在内的世界各国人民的美好梦想是相通的。
The Chinese dream is to realize national prosperity, rejuvenation, and happiness. It is a dream of peace, development, cooperation, and global win. It is linked with the beautiful dream of people all over the world, including the American dream.
其实呢，这个习近平总书记的他的这些论述呢，实现中国的梦，就是要实现中华民族的伟大复兴。这就说明历史上中华民族有过复兴，这就肯定了儒家在历史上发挥的重要作用。
In fact,
the Chinese, both the left and right, in terms of position of politics, were against Confucianism. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was a slogan, "Down with the Confucius show." And actually, some people actually advocated not only we get rid of Confucianism, but also get rid of Chinese characters, Chinese writing system, adopt the alphabetic system. So the whole idea of China being backward because of traditional values, get rid of them. Now, the Communist Party of China actually based its credential as a modern party, revolutionary party, by being critical of Chinese tradition. And one of the things, for instance, during the most radical period in the Mao era, and there's a slogan called "Get rid of the 4 olds." Old ideas, old culture, old customs, old habits. So now the Communist Party reversed the whole ideological direction. This is not something that is very, very light, we can take it for granted. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party, I hope Prosper will come back to this about Marxism and so on. Because the Chinese Communist Party seems to be departing from Marxism, departing from the theory of class struggle, by embracing Chinese traditional values. I think that's the first point. But also, sometimes it's ambiguous. I don't know whether some of you can remember, but at one point, some years ago, they put up a Confucius statue on the Tiananmen Square. And then, quite quickly, they removed it, because it was so controversial. That's symbolic of the uncertainty and the ambiguity of the Communist Party and the Chinese government adopting Chinese traditional values. The second point I want to draw from this talk is there's so many Confucian values. The one thing that I come very strongly that relevant to us is the 和而不同. And it's translated as harmony with diversity. But I think, you can translate differently, like peace, being together, but allow differences. And this is a very important concept. I'll just give 2 examples. And one example, Professor Kung listed is there's not been religious war in Chinese history. So Confucianism is very tolerant of other ideas, other religions. There was no religious war in Chinese history. And the other thing that I want to mention here is the Chinese foreign policy. For a long time, the Chinese government is blamed for not imposing conditions on these rogue states when the Chinese wanted to do business with them. By Western tradition, you have to impose democracy, human rights conditions if you want money. The Chinese never care about it. But from the Chinese point of view, that is non-interference of internal affairs. In other words, every state has the right to pursue its own road to modernity, to development. No, foreign countries have no right to interfere. And that actually is directly a heritage of the Confucius idea, 和而不同. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Earl. This is, I have, I think it's because it's very interesting. I'm going to read out the full amount of the bio. Apart from voyages by container ship and riding his bicycle as long and as far as he can, Roland Bauer is a writer and academic. His passion lies in the contacts and surprising interactions between religion and Marxism. Currently, he divides his time between Beijing and Newcastle, Australia. In Beijing, he teaches at the Renmin University of China, while in Newcastle, he researches at the university there. And Roland studies degrees in Western classics, Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and divinity, with an emphasis on Hebrew, Syriac, I don't know what that is, Coptic, I don't know what it is, and Biblical Greek. And a crucial turn took place when, with his master's degree, where he turned to Hegel and Marx in order to develop the theory of alienation and revolution. Now, all these terms are very, very, very intellectual. And ever since, he has been interested in the intersection between religion and Marxism, so much so that his question became the focus of his doctoral studies. So Marxism and religion, one of the famous saying attributed to Marx is, religion is the opium of the people. Yeah? And is that a strange topic? Who could possibly be interested in that? So today, we're going to have Professor Bowen to talk about Confucianism and the Chairman Mao, now, then and now. Professor Bowen.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It is my honour to be here with such distinguished people. I feel very ordinary and common in the presence of such distinguished guests. I will stick with my text because we have a couple of translators who are working the text into Chinese. And we can discuss some of the issues in the question and answer later. So let's begin. Chairman Mao's attitudes towards Confucius seem reasonably well known. For Mao, he was the embodiment of outdated feudalistic thought, the spokesman of the decadent slave-owning aristocracy. The contrast with today could not be sharper. When the study of Confucianism is fostered by the Chinese government, symbolised by the celebration of 10 years of Confucius Institutes worldwide. Yet the relation between Mao Zedong and Confucius is far more complex than this simplistic opposition suggests. However, instead of general comparisons, I wish to spend a few minutes focusing on the actual texts by Chairman Mao. I do so because I am trained in, and my great love, is textual work. I also do so since the focus of my work continues to involve the fascinating engagements between Marxism and religion. Let me be clear. My argument is neither that Mao and Confucius are diametrically opposed, nor that a deeper harmony may be found between their works. Instead, I argue that Mao Zedong continued to struggle with Confucius throughout his life. At times, he condemns Confucius or what the name Confucius stands for, and at other times he seeks to understand Confucius and his role in modern China. In order to see how this is so, I propose to follow a simple but effective argument, or at least I think it's effective. I begin with Mao Zedong's negative observations on Confucius, before turning to his positive comments. I close by asking whether the relation between these negative and positive images is merely a contradiction, or whether it becomes dialectical. If it is dialectical, it has profound implications for today. Since I cannot deal with all of Chairman Mao's many texts on Confucius here, I focus on the most significant ones in each of the three steps of my argument. Let us begin with the negative. Perhaps the best text summing up Mao's negative view of Confucius is as follows, from 1957. It's quite blunt. Mao writes, "There is no end to learning from experience. People make mistakes when they are young, but is it true that older people can avoid making mistakes?" Confucius said, everything he did conformed to objective laws when he was 70. I just don't believe it. That's bullshit. Bullshit. Mao could not be blunter. Not so bluntly, perhaps, we find many other statements in which Confucius embodies the old feudal China. For Mao, Confucius speaks from the perspective of the old ruling class, the landlords and exploiters, with the aim of ensuring that the ancient hierarchical system continues to function smoothly. But was this a late development in Mao Zedong's thought? A careful study of his writings indicates that he was already reading anti-Confucian literature in his youth, such as that by Tan Zitong and his sweeping and systematic attacks on the traditional Confucian customs and institutions. At about the same time, he observes, "I think that old man Confucius' bureaucratic airs must be somewhat attenuated after all these years." The context was, of course, the immense debate over new studies from outside China. So strong did such a direction seem that Mao observes that any effort to stick to Confucius and resist the new learning was tantamount to making the Changjiang, the Yangtze River, flow back in the opposite direction from the Kunlun Mountains, so that people from China could get to Europe by just taking a boat over the Kunlun Range. In this light, we may understand his early attacks on old methods of education, the fostering of new schools in Hunan, his deep criticism of old marriage customs, and even the use of Confucius to justify subservience to the Japanese occupation. In short, this is what he and his friends called the problem of Confucius. He would gradually become more openly critical of Confucius, advocating alternatives to the Confucian tradition, such as Lu Xun, or the dialectical materialism of Marx, Engels and Lenin. And already in 1927, he famously stated, "A revolution is not like inviting people to a dinner, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be refined so leisurely and gentle, so, to quote Confucius, benign, upright, courteous, temperate, and complacent." The refined and gentle qualities are precisely those that Confucius is said to have used when he sought information about the governments of countries he visited. Perhaps the clearest statement of this negative image appears some years later in the important text on New Democracy. He writes, "China also has a semi-feudal culture reflecting its semi-feudal politics and economy, whose exponents include all those who advocate the worship of Confucius, the study of the Confucian canon and the old ethical code and the old ideas in opposition to the new culture and new ideas. This kind of reactionary culture serves the imperialists and the feudal class and must be swept away. Unless it is swept away, no new culture of any kind can be built up. There is no construction without destruction, no flowing without damming, and no motion without rest. The two are locked in a life and death struggle." I don't wish to say more on the negative image of Confucius in Mao Zedong's writings. I think they are reasonably well known. But instead, let us now focus on the positive image. In one of his early texts, Mao states, "The writings of the Confucian scholars are different from those of the men of letters. The former were translucent and pure, but the latter unrestrained and argumentative." Is this an isolated occurrence restricted to the young Mao when he was a diligent and restive student who knew Confucius' works exceedingly well? Not at all. I give 3 examples. The first concerns Yang Hui, Confucius' favoured disciple, whom Mao praises for his simple life on a number of occasions. To quote, "With a single bamboo dish of rice, a single gourd dish of drink, and living in his mean narrow lane, he did not allow his joy to be affected by it. A second example is in the early essay called A Study of Physical Education. If you have not read it, I suggest you do. Here, Mao famously outlines his daily gym routine with some intriguing and difficult exercises that should be performed naked. He writes, "Too much clothing impedes movement. Exercise should be savage and rude." Just imagine the naked Mao doing his exercises in the morning and the evening. I won't describe the exercises. But where does he find the theoretical justification for such daily discipline? From the Confucian texts, references to which appear throughout the essay. Indeed, Confucius died at the age of 72, and I have not heard that his body was not healthy. The third example is more substantial, with lengthy assessments of the political significance of the Confucian doctrine of the mean. I cannot go into detail here, so I restrict myself to pointing out that the crucial Marxist argument to avoid leftism and rightism is now understood in terms of the mean. For Mao, these two tendencies may be seen as excess and falling short. Instead, one should, and he quotes Confucius, hold two extremes and employ the mean. And one should stand erect in the middle and not incline to either side. I could cite many further examples, but I've chosen these three concerning simple living, the discipline of physical exercise, and the value of the mean, since they would deepen over time and pervade later teaching and practice. The later invocations may not mention Confucius by name, but the inspiration is his. Yet at other times, Confucius does appear, especially in the intriguing rectification campaigns, a further example to add to the ones I've just given. The slogans of the rectification campaigns often drew upon the classics, especially Confucius. So, from 1957, he writes, "I propose a general review be made of the work of eliminating counter-revolutionaries, either this year or the next year, in order to sum up the experience, promote justice, and stem evil trends." And here, justice, zhengqi, evokes the spirit of rectitude and justice that in Confucius teaching, especially in Mencius, is the fundamental spirit of heaven and earth. The most pointed reference to Confucius appears in a text called On Dialectical Materialism, where Mao writes, "When internal examination discovers nothing wrong, what is there to be anxious about? What is there to fear?" This is also a correct saying of Confucius. The implications for today's mass line or anti-corruption campaign being pursued by President Xi Jinping should be obvious. So now the third part of my argument. What are we to make of this complex picture? One approach is to assume, following Mao's own comments, that he may have studied Confucius in his youth, but that such study was not much use. Another is to suggest that Mao was largely hostile to Confucius and that the occasional comments and references are mere window dressing for a deeper antipathy to the purveyor of feudal values. Neither is correct, it seems to me. Instead, Mao Zedong's own texts indicate a far more complex picture. We find throughout his works the ebb and flow of resolutely negative engagement side by side with sustained and even positive assessments of the legacy of Confucius. Is this a simple contradiction, as Mao struggled to come to terms with Confucius? At times it seems like an unresolved contradiction, but at others it is more dialectical. And this has implications for the situation in China today regarding Confucius and Chairman Mao. Among other texts, I am particularly interested in On the New Stage, which makes the point very clearly, and due to its importance, and some of you may know this text, due to its importance, I give a longer quotation. Another of our tasks is to study our historical heritage and use the Marxist method to sum it up critically. The history of this great nation of ours goes back several thousand years. It has its own laws of development, its own national characteristics, and many precious treasures. From Confucius to Sun Yat-sen, we must sum it up critically, and we must constitute ourselves the heir to this precious legacy. Conversely, the assimilation of this legacy itself becomes a method that aids considerably in guiding the present great movement. As a communist is a Marxist internationalist, but Marxism must take on a national form before it can be put into practice. If a Chinese communist, who was a part of the great Chinese people, bound to his people by his very flesh and blood, talks of Marxism apart from Chinese peculiarities, this Marxism is merely an empty abstraction. Consequently, the sinification of Marxism, it begins with Chairman Mao, and Deng Xiaoping took it up later. The sinification of Marxism, that is to say, making certain that in all its manifestations it is imbued with Chinese characteristics, using it according to Chinese peculiarities, becomes a problem that must be understood and solved by the whole party without delay. Our attitude towards ourselves should be, quoting Confucius, to learn without satiety and to order others to instruct without being wearied. So Confucius is, in this understanding, at the beginning of this precious legacy which makes up the specific characteristics of China. Mao suggests his work must be summed up critically, weighed and assessed, and discussed. Confucius is therefore a crucial feature of the sinification of Marxism with Chinese characteristics. I suggest that this complex understanding of Confucius and Chairman Mao's works, this dialectical understanding, sets the context for the engagement with Confucius today. The Neo-Confucian movement and the way in which the government and also Chinese society are dealing with this complex heritage, also the heritage of Chairman Mao. Thank you.
Now I have the answer. What's the relation among the three important figures, Marx, Mao, and Confucius? So Mao made Marxism Chinese by drawing ideas from Confucius, right? So, I think I totally agree with Professor Bowen. In other words, when I said the Communist Party of China based its credential on criticizing Confucianism or traditional Chinese values by being modern and progressive and so on and so forth. But the picture is more complex than that, as Andrew Bowles says. So Mao and the Communist Party were inspired by Confucianism when they absorbed Western ideas. Okay, now next speaker is Professor Yan. Professor Yan is a PhD student supervisor at Shandong University and is a leading representative of China's contemporary Neo-Confucianism. Professor Yan is known as Mr. Four or Yan the Four Books. You know what this refers to? Because the Confucianist tenets, the Confucian doctrine or classical doctrines of Confucianism are within the four books, the four classical work, or the four books. So Professor Yan teaches four books at the university, and it's a very popular course, and so the students call him Yan the Four Books. Now, today his topic is again the value of Confucius doctrines in contemporary China. So please welcome Professor Yan.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Yan Binga, and I come from Shandong University. I'm speaking in Chinese. 我想麻烦我的翻译，我把我今天所要讲的题目做一些简单的转换。
I'd like to ask my interpreter to make some changes in my title of the speech today.
因为当我写完文章的时候，我就不愿意再读我的文章。
Because after I have written my article, I do not want to read it again. So.
当我昨天通过一夜的飞行，从北半球到了南半球，我有了新的想法。
So yesterday, after I have a flight from the North Hemisphere to the South Hemisphere, I have some new ideas.
我在想，我的题目是孔子还活着吗？
So I'm thinking, is Confucius still alive today?
大家都知道，中国有一位诗人，他叫臧可嘉，他写过2首诗。他说，有的人活着，但他已经死了；有的人死了，但他仍然活着。
We all know that there is a poet in China who is called Zhang Kejia. He wrote 2 poems. One is that some people may have died, but they are still alive. But some people may be dead, but they are still alive today.
孔子作为一个具体的历史人物，已经死了，但他今天依然活着。
Confucius, as a historical figure, is dead today, but he is still alive. His spirit is still alive.
而且他越活越精彩。
And his spirit is more popular today.
越活越伟大，
He has become a great man.
越活他的生命力越强。
He's become more vital and ambitious today.
这样我的观点就和美国一个学者叫叶伟森，他的观点不同。美国有个学者叫叶伟森，他说孔子在当代中国已经成为博物馆的陈列品了。
Well, My point of view is different from that of Levinson. The American scholar Joseph Levinson said in his book, The Confucian China and Its Modern Fate, that Confucius has become the exhibit in the museum that he's decorated.
还有一位非常著名的学者叫鲁因时，他说儒家孔子已经成为游魂了，已经魂不附体了。
There is also a scholar, that's a Chinese scholar called Yu Yingshi. He said that the Confucianism is already dead. It has become the floating ghost.
我的观点不同意他们的观点。
I disagree with them.
这像刚才的教授所讲的，即使是毛泽东，他对孔夫子也不可能全部从他身上剔除一样。我们今天在当代无法完全剔除孔夫子的存在意义和价值。
Just like the professor said, even Chairman Mao Zedong cannot disregard Confucius. So even today, in the modern time, we cannot underestimate the significance and importance of Confucius.
我可以从几个现象的列举向大家报告一下孔夫子在当代的中国。
From several phenomena, I can demonstrate the importance of Confucius and the Confucian doctrines in China.
可以说，从上世纪90年代以来，孔夫子有强烈的在中国大陆有强烈的回归之势。中国大陆的今天是全世界儒学最为活跃的地区。
Since the 1990s, Confucius and the Confucianism has already experienced a strong revival in the mainland China. And we can say that the mainland China has become the most dynamic region in all of the world to revive the spirit of Confucius.
我作为国家的一个课题《国际儒学发展报告》的主编，我在这个地方给大家提供几个数字。
As the editor of an important journal, I would like to give you some numbers.
2002年，中国大陆发表了有关儒学和孔夫子的文章6638篇。
In 2002, there were 6,638 articles and publications about that was regard to the Confucius and the Confucianism in China.
出版相关的论著1200多部。
The books about 1,000.
在中国大陆省级以上有关研究孔子儒学的学会有140多家。
On the provincial level, the institute that I committed to study the study of Confucius and Confucianism are over 1,000.
以书院就是传统儒学的传播的这样的一个机构，就是传统的书院，以书院之名命名的，包括民办的，包括传统的，包括现代书院，有接近2000家。
In terms of the traditional academy, the study of the classics that is devoted to the spreading of Confucianism, there are about 2,000, both the private run and government run, both traditional and modern.
可以这样讲，儒学不仅仅是指政治所倡导的一种理念，它更是民众的生活需求。
So we can say that the Confucianism is not only the idea and the guideline to govern the officials, it's also about to meet the needs of the public.
在今天的儒学复兴， 不是执政者提倡的，而是民间，更多的是来自于民间自发的、主动的行为。
So we can say that the revival of the Confucianism is not only proposed and promoted by the government officials, more like the voluntary movement that is stimulated by the public.
我现在是作为孔夫子的出生地，我们北京、山东，还有像美国等一些地区的学者，共同建的一个书院，叫尼山圣人书院。我作为那个书院的执行院长，我们书院就在周围的乡村开展入学，叫做乡村入学运动。
I come from the birthplace of Confucius, that is Shandong province. And in Shandong province, we set up a academy of the traditional academy that is called Nishan Shuyuan. In partnership with the scholars from Beijing, Shandong, and America and other Western countries, we are committed to spreading the spirit of Confucius, and I'm the executive director of that academy. And we as academy, we are very active in spreading the culture and spirit of Confucius in the countryside.
我们通过一年对村民的儒学教育收到了非常好的效果。
Over 1 year, we have reaped very positive results from our education and cultivation of the country farmers.
我们现在有7个对村民开设的儒学讲学点。
Now we have set up 7 centers to educate the farmers.
听我们讲授的既有老人，也有孩子。
Our students include to the elder and the young.
所以形成了非常好的一种文化氛围。
So we have a very good atmosphere and study environment.
我的孔子今天他活着，他之所以活着，他有活着的根据。我今天就向大家报告一下，为什么孔子今天会活着。
So we can say that Confucius is still alive because I have reasons to say this. So today I would like to give you a speech about why I think Confucius is still alive.
翻译这个 PPT。是这里。我跳过这一部分。
I will skip this part.
孔子的学说，孔子是山东人，但孔子的学说不是为山东人设计，也不是为中国人设计，它是为所有称之为人的人设计的。
Confucius comes from Shandong, but the Confucian doctrines are not specially designed for the Shandong people or even the Chinese people. We can say that it is designed for all the people of Ren. Ren means benevolence or etiquette.
只要我们人想向上提升，而不是向下堕落；只要我们人怀想过文明、优雅的生活，那么我们就离不开孔子的主张和孔子的教导。
As long as people are come forward instead backward, or people designed for the cultural life, we cannot live without Confucian doctrines.
孔子思想的最大意义，就给我们提出了人为什么是人，人何以成为人，人怎样才能成为一个理想的人。
The significance of the Confucian doctrines that it rests on three questions. That is why, how, and what is people 人 is called benevolent people, and how to be an ideal person.
什么样人才能成为人呢？这就是孔子的一个核心观念，就是所谓仁爱的这个人。
What kind of person or people can be called the people of benevolence? I think that is the core value of the whole system. 人 is actually is about loving people.
所以人只有爱心、有同情心、有关注、帮助他人之心，才能成为人，才不同于动物。如果人没有爱心、没有关怀和帮助他人之心，人干脆就不是个人，他就是禽兽。用今天观点说，他是动物。
So as long as people have passion or mercy and care about people, that is what makes him a virtuous person. That is what makes him different from animals. Without all of this, people are basically animals.
人不仅要做一个人，还要做一个好人，做一个君。什么样的人是好人呢？在孔子那里，君子是好人。最好的好人就是圣贤。
We also need to be a kind person. So what kind of person is a kind of virtuous person? That is a gentleman or nobleman, or even better, that is sage.
如何才能成为一个君子，成为一个圣贤？那么就要受到礼乐，就要有礼乐教养。
So how can people become a gentleman or even saint or sage? They must have a li, that is rights or propriety.
所以，孔子回答他的高祖颜子的那句话：“克己复礼为人”，非常非常的重要。
So when asked answer the questions about the meaning of 人, Kongzi told his disciple Yan Yuan that one needs to restrain oneself and completely overcome selfishness and keep to pride.
我们知道，孔子不仅仅提出了一套人学的主张和观念，而且孔子儒家的思想不仅仅要做好一个人，还要管理好这个社会。
We all know that Confucius has proposed the Ren, that is the benevolence doctrines, but the Confucianism is more than that. It also raises a question about how to run a country.
如何管理好这个社会呢？孔子就提出了为政一德的主张。
So how to run a country and govern a country? Confucius raised the idea of rule of virtue.
孔子的主张，一个社会的管理者应该是社会的精英，而不是社会的庸人。
Confucius thinks that the leaders of the country should be the elites instead of ordinary people.
作为一个社会的精英，必须具备3个条件：一个是良好的品质仁德，一个是智慧代表着才能，一个是决断力代表着勇敢。在儒家那个地方，在孔子那里，智、仁、勇作为执政者3个必须具备的要件。
Confucius thinks that the elites should meet 3 basic requirements. The first is moral integrity, the second is wisdom, the last one is decisiveness, that is courage. Confucius thinks that all these 3 points are very important and basic. I also skipped this part.
由于时间关系，
Given
大家知道，
limited time.
孔子是一个伟大的教育家。
We all know that Confucius is a great educator.
作为伟大的教育家，孔子的教育理念，直到今天也没有完全实现。
As a great educator, Confucius' philosophy has not been fully realized.
孔子提出了有教无类的主张。
Confucius raised the philosophy, the notion, the concept of making no distinctions in teaching.
孔子开出了自从古到今师生关系的典范。
Confucius has set a good example in terms of the teacher-student relationship.
孔子的好多的教学理念和教学主张，直到今天仍然对我们有了启发意义。
Many of his pedagogical ideas are still very inspirational today.
我想，由于时间关系，我在这个地方就，大家去看 PPT 就可以了，我就不给大家讲。
Given the limited time, I won't elaborate on this. You can refer to my PowerPoint slides later.
我要给大家最后谈一点，就是孔子主张天下为公的大同理想。
The last point is about all people under the heaven are equal.
为了节约时间关系，我让翻译直接读大同的英文。
Given the limited time, I will take you the basic idea of the Grand Union. That is, when the Grand Cause was pursued, a public and a common spirit ruled all under the sky. They chose men of talent, virtue, and ability. Their words are sincere, and what they cultivated was harmony. But people did not love their parents only, nor treat their children as their own sons. A competent provision was secured for the aged until their death, employment for the able-bodied, and the means of growing up to the young. They showed kindness and compassion to widows, orphans, childish men, and those who were disabled by disease, so that they were all sufficiently maintained. Males had their proper work, and the females had their homes. They accumulated articles of value, disliking that they should be thrown away upon the ground, but not wishing to keep them for their own gratification. They labored with their strength, disliking that they should be exerted, but not exerting that only with a view of their own advantage. In this way, selfish schemings were repressed and find no development. Robbers, filchers, and rebellious traitors did not show themselves, and hence the outdoors remained open and were not shut. This is the period that we call the Grand Union.
大家看完了英文的孔子的大同对未来社会的设想，我想我们每一个在座的人都心向往之。
After you have listened to the English translation of Confucius' inspiration and the picture for the future that is a Grand Union, I think we all very looking forward to that day.
我在这里看到窗外的河流、草坪和在河流上、草坪上嬉戏的人们，看到了孟子的和孔子的大同理想，好像即将实现。
Standing here, looking out the window, I saw the laws, the rivers, and the people on the laws and relaxing themselves. It seems like I have seen the picture that Confucius has painted for us.
大同是孔子的千年之梦，也是中华民族永恒的期盼，也是全人类共同的梦想。
Drawing on the history, Confucius has painted a great picture for us, and these aspirations also shared by the Chinese nation and the whole world.
当我要结束我的演讲的时候，我想告诉大家一个秘密。
Before I conclude my speech, I'd like to tell you a secret.
大家知道孔子的妈妈姓什么吗？
Do you know what Confucius' mother believes in?
孔子的妈妈姓颜。 就是我这个颜色的颜。
Sorry, it's actually Confucius' mother's surname. That surname is also professors.
也许我们在座的朋友都不知道，孔子的爸爸在孔子3岁的时候就去世了。
Maybe you don't know that Confucius' father has passed away when he was only 3 years old.
孔子完全是在一个少年妈妈的抚养教育下长大成人。
So Confucius was raised by a very young mother.
所以我经常给我们信孔的朋友说，孔子伟大圣人的出现，有孔家的一半，更有颜家的一半。
So I often tell the friends with the surname Kong that is the reason that is great people like Confucius. There is a part of the contribution comes from the Kong family, also a part comes from Yan family.
我要告诉大家，颜家和孔家的故事还没有说完。
I want to tell you that the story are not ending yet.
我们颜家还是孔子弟子3000当中孔子最欣赏的学生，颜回的后人。
In our Yan family, there is one student that is Confucius' favorite disciple.
我之所以能够站在这个地方和大家相见，我要拜托是祖宗所赐的福。
The reason that I can stand here and give you a speech, I would like to thank my ancestors.
山东大学的教授多也，比我有研究的教授更是多如牛毛，比我研究儒学更好的教授更是多如牛毛。
In Shandong University, there are a lot of professors who are more accomplished than me.
我之所以能够站在这个地方，是因为我是福圣公颜子79代孙。
I can be here because I'm the 79 descendants of the Yan Sheng Gong. That is also a very famous and.
福圣公，不是衍圣公，他是衍圣公，是福圣公。
福圣公。
您自己要福圣就好。大家知道，中国历代知识分子所追求的不仅是孔孟之道，更是孔颜乐处的人生境界。
We all know that the intellectuals in China, what they are pursuing is not only the Confucian doctrines, they also aspire to the life, spirit, or attitude.
孔颜乐处就是孔子所赞扬他的最好、最得意的学生。颜子的话，所谓一箪食，一瓢饮，在陋巷，人也不堪其忧，回也不改其乐，贤哉为也。
Confucius praises Yan Hui's attitude towards life. That is, even if he eats and dresses poorly, normal people won't have understand this, but Yan enjoys it very much.
还有孔子说的“不义而富且犯疏祀饮水，曲肱而枕之，乐亦在其中矣。不义而富且贵，于我不云。”
Confucius also said that I may not have enough food or water, and I may not have comfortable accommodation, but the wealth gained from injustice means nothing to me.
我觉得孔颜乐处给我们开出的是一种人生态度和人生境界。
This philosophy has given a glimpse of what is living spirit and attitude.
这种人生态度和人生境界，寄托着中国古代乃至到今天知识分子的追求和理想。
This attitude is deeply associated with intellectuals' aspiration.
我愿献给大家，成为大家共同的人生态度和人生境界。
I'd like to tell you about this and hope that you can share this with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. What can we take away from here? I think we can see obviously Professor is a passionate teacher. And you can see that he quotes Confucius' sayings fluently without any thinking, without any looking. I mean, I can't do it in one way. But I think Professor Yan is also very idealistic, like Confucius was. Now, if you look at outside the gate, it's very peaceful, like a cartoon. An ideal world for the people. Peaceful, happy, clean. But it's quite possible, somebody who's walking there, there's turmoil in his heart. So, in Western societies, lots of problems as well. No society is ideal. Lots of problems. And when we come to the concluding session, I might mention something about this, like, you know, lots of people in the West are actually disillusioned with how democracy is being practiced, for instance. Okay. Now, next speaker is Rich Little, who's not little. Just like me, Mr. Gow's a little tall, eh? Okay. Rich Little was an Australian diplomat for 25 years, working in Japan, Laos, Bangladesh, the United Nations, New York, Ireland, Hong Kong, China, Switzerland, and the Caribbean. What else? He was deputy head mission in 5 persons, serving in Canberra as director of North Asia International Economic and Organizations and Policy Planning, as well as executive director of Australia-China Council. And Rich Little is also obtained high-level language qualifications in Japanese and Chinese. So you do speak Chinese. Yeah. And is a founding director of the Beijing-based International Confucian Association. His time in Japan from 1964 to 1969 led to his cultural-based judgment in Beijing in 1976 that China would emulate Japanese growth. That was a very, very accurate prediction, long time ago. You know, all the China watchers and the China scholars failed to predict anything about China. It also led to the Confucian Renaissance in 1989 and the tyranny of fortune, Australia's Asian destiny in 1997, and a Confucian Taoist millennium. That's a good mixture of 2 philosophies in 2007. So a very accomplished writer as well. And he was also the vice president of the International Confucian Association and is the academic committee of the East Asia Western Relations. So, Richard Little's topic is contrasting thought culture. Professor, please welcome Richard Little.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gao. I'm glad you foreshadowed the disillusionment with democracy, because I doubt there's anyone more disillusioned and more critical of it than myself. I'm a little bit taken back, though, that to some degree you've stolen my thunder, because initially I wanted to go through a little background, but I will focus on the underlying passages. That's Beijing in 76, Confucian Renaissance in 89, Tyranny of Fortune 97 and Confucian Tao's Millennium 2007. In each of those instances, I took predictive positions that said things were going to happen that were highly unfashionable and were very much criticised. In each case, they've been correct. In 1976, on the basis of my conviction that Japan's remarkable growth was founded on its culture, which was Confucian, I maintained in the Australian Embassy that China would emulate it. We eventually sent a dispatch which the Prime Minister was very pleased with and the Department of Foreign Affairs was very displeased with. Although 31 years later, they had a public lecture about how good that reporting was. It took them 31 years though. With the Confucian Renaissance, almost all academics, almost all other diplomats, almost all intellectuals. But nevertheless, I've been able to get a few projections right. I've gained considerable recognition in China, which I've not gained in Australia. I should point out that the International Confucian Association, of which I've been a vice president, one of 11, but the only non-ethnic Asian for the last 5 years, has had as its president during that time, Ye Xuanping. Now, Ye Xuanping is the eldest son of Ye Zhenying. And Ye Zhenying is the general who arrested the Gang of Four in 1976, put Deng Xiaoping in power, and effectively launched China on its modernization. Although I agree also with one of our earlier speakers that Mao in many ways was a Confucian. I heard a brilliant lecture by a young American academic delivered in Chinese a few years ago in Nishan, in which he argued that Mao was a typical Chinese Confucian reformer who needed to come along in a period of decline and rescue the tradition and regenerate it. And I think that's exactly what Mao's done. And I think in that context, Marxism really becomes an irrelevance. It was an ideology that was useful for the time because China faced this challenge from the West, but now the rhetoric is maintained because it's difficult to just drop it overnight. But the vital force in China is very much the traditional Confucian culture. How do I go on to the next slide? Next slide. Oh, which one? Sorry. No. Wrong way around. Good. Now, I've mentioned already, I'm taking these three classics as fundamental to tradition. And I want to just take excerpts that strike me from the three classics. I don't suggest they are representative of any sort of consensus of what's important about these, but it's my perception, trying to unravel this tradition in terms of figuring out how Australia fits into the future, that I've just highlighted. The first three lines of the Analects highlight the importance of education, application, and review of that. And I think that is totally fundamental to the tradition, and I think it's something what almost everyone in the West totally undervalues. Secondly, it highlights the value of people of education of considerable distinction coming together and rediscovering one another after periods of being apart. And having been a diplomat, I can sympathise with that a lot. But of course, in ancient China, even in Confucius' day, many of the educated people moved around and rediscovered themselves, their relationships after periods of separation. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, is the quality of humility. This invariably disarms non-Confucians. Now, I'll tell you a story about this. I was struck in the 60s with the way the Japanese were outsmarting the Americans at almost every point. When I went to Laos a little bit later, I was amazed at the way the Vietnamese were doing the same thing. Now, it was 20 or 30 years later, I picked up a book on the 7 military classics of China, in which you had Zhang Taigong's 6 secret teachings. Now, Zhang Taigong was a general who helped King Wen establish the Zhou dynasty 3,000 years ago. He probably didn't write the 6 secret teachings, but they were attributed to him because of his distinction. Some people speculate that, in fact, was written by Confucian scholars who wanted to show the value of Confucian values in strategic situations. Now, it seemed to me this was what Japan was doing to America almost immediately after 1945, because within those 6 secret teachings there are 12 civil offences. And you can summarise those 12 civil offences in 3 words: conquest through service. What did Japan do after 45? As a unified nation, it set about serving America, building American dependency, building American vulnerability. I saw that takeoff period, and I was amazed at the way the Japanese got everything by giving the Americans everything they could want. And of course, once Japan had done it, everyone else in Asia saw it could be done because they were familiar with the classics, basically, and they followed suit. And of course, the really big one came when China, after Mao's death, pursued the same strategies. And now we see the whole global power structure is totally reconstructed, although there's still denial goes on about that in the English-speaking world. The Tao Te Ching, the first 2 lines of that, took me 20 years of knowing those before I gave them any meaning. And they can be translated roughly as, the way that can be travelled is not the everlasting way. The name that can be named is not the everlasting name. Now, when I finally gave them a meaning, it was that anything you can put into words, concepts, principles, rational structures, scientific theory is very useful for this, for us talking, but doesn't really tell you what's going on out there. And once that I gave it that meaning, all of my thinking changed. And I'll explain a little bit later what I think that change represented. Now, the Book of Changes is one I'm less familiar with than the other 2, although I wouldn't claim great familiarity with any of them. But it seems to me it's designed to work as a book of divination, which essentially is there to remind its users of the essentials of life. It throws up all sorts of apparent divination, but which have to be interpreted. And in the interpretation, people are thrown back on those things they have to address in their lives. And it does this in a way that underlines both the permanent and the ever-changing aspects of human life. Now, oh yes, I should mention, on the first page I did show as my second last point that I spent 3 months at the 4 Seas Academy just outside Beijing, 4 Seas Confucian Academy, in 2 years ago. Now, at that academy, they teach children from the age of 3 the classics by rote. And I've had a little boy of 5 stand in front of me like this and very proudly recite word perfect these chapters. And I'd go away and I'd say, what does this do? And it obviously means anyone who's had that education, his whole life is interpreted and filtered through that wisdom, which is 2,000 years ago. Now, there are a few points come from this. One, very early on, they have a discipline and an appetite for learning you don't have in the West. 2, they have mastered a language which gives them access to 2,500 or more years of history, which no one in the West has, of course, in the language in which it was actually written at the time. And 3, it gives them this very, very rich sense of a cultural tradition. And I think it's this that highlights the fact that anyone who belongs to this Chinese thought culture thinks differently to any native English speaker in this room. I should also emphasize here that the Confucian world is not China. It's Japan, it's Korea, it's Vietnam, and it's all of Southeast Asia. Because while the rest of Southeast Asia may not have had periods where it was under a Confucian political order, when you get to know these countries, they invariably have commercial and administrative elites who are Chinese and who preserve Chinese classical educational habits and who set standards of educational excellence, whether it's Indonesia or Burma or wherever, that really define success for non-Chinese people in those communities. Because unless you meet the educational excellence of the Chinese, you're just not competitive. So you have to think of all East and Southeast Asia as being Confucian. And that's all of Australia's Asian future, of course. Unless, once you get to India, it changes. But that's probably another issue. But it's not, doesn't necessarily contradict any of this. Now, now, contrasting thought cultures. On the one hand, you've got the Western thought culture. That goes back basically to the Greek classics, in which I take Plato's writings as being perhaps the most seminal. And I take Plato's notion of forms as being fundamental. Now, what's critical about this is, I think, that, well, I'll leave that to the moment. When you go from the Greek philosophers to the Roman Church's doctrine, dogma, which picked up Neoplatonism really as a way of communicating with its world. And then with the Enlightenment, you got another fundamental shift to what we now call universal values: democracy, equality, freedom, rule of law, all of these qualities. When you look at the Confucian East and Southeast Asia, you have one tradition of classics which are read today in the language in which they were written over 2,000 years ago. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they're learned today by 3-year-olds in China. And on that, I'll tell you a story. I have a Danish Chinese friend who has a young child. And a child who hadn't reached 1, and she was exploring the right preschools to send the child to, and she was shocked and disgusted when she was told at these schools, we won't teach your child any alphabet until they're 6. And she says, how can this be? The best learning years are from 3 to 6. Now, who in the West understands that? We're somehow or other encouraged to leave our children in front of the television so they can be addicted to commercial advertisements in those critical years of 3 to 6. The young Chinese who goes to one of these schools, and I understand there are more than 1,000 of them throughout China today, essentially all private. These are a response to a popular demand. Sorry, I lost my train there for a moment. But I mean, the point is that you have this continuity and it's alive, vibrant, and explosive in China today. It's also equally alive and vibrant throughout Southeast Asia. In the last 3 months, I've been to conferences in both Malaysia and Vietnam as a result of this Confucian interest. Now, the contrasting thought cultures, this is where it gets really interesting. The Western thought culture, which goes back to Plato and his transcendent forms, is abstract, it's rational, it's theoretical, and it's faith-based. They're all good things, aren't they? They're all words we fall back on as positive words. When you start to think through the Analects, the Tao Te Ching, the Yi Ching, particularly as a group, you say these all promote thinking that's holistic, that's fluid, that's intuitive, and that's practical. There's no phasing. In fact, Confucius at some stage says, managing my affairs in this world is so difficult, I have no time to bother about some world other world. Now, when you start to think of those fundamental differences, you say, it starts to explain why it was so easy for Japan and then other countries to understand what America's basic operational principles were, then turn them to Japanese advantage, and totally, basically denude the American economy with some help from its Asian neighbours over time. Now, this has progressed a long way today. If we talk about the future and who's building the future, who's strategizing the future, it's not the Platonic thinkers. There are no Platonic thinkers today. I would dare anyone in this room to stand up and credibly name one Western leader who is worthy of respect. And yet I would say both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, who seems to have learned a lot from his visits to China, his visits to Shaolin Temple, are remarkably clever leaders. Now, this is beginning to take shape in the demise of the post-1945 United Nations system and the Atlantic Authority. The Atlantic Authority really being the authority of the Anglo-American world. What's happening is that those institutions have got so much built into the privileges for the Americans and British who were successful in World War II in 1945 that they're becoming totally out of sync with real power structures today. And one of the consequences of this is that, now I find it very interesting, you've got the B-R-I-C-K-S bank there. Somebody has corrected my spelling, because the correct spelling is B-R-I-C-S. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that acronym is so unfamiliar. People might think, well, it should have a K there. And that tells you about how well educated we are by our media and by our academics, I should say. We are just kept ill-informed. In fact, you can see at work in the English-speaking world today exactly what George Orwell described in 1984. Except I suspect he was writing also about the past as well as the future. If you stop to think about it for a moment, which people could reasonably think that Britain was engaged in a civilizing exercise where it was plundering and pillaging countries in other parts of the world? Now, I'm not knocking the incredible achievements of the English world. It has transformed the world in many ways for good, in many ways for bad. But the fact is, our habits of abstract, rational, theoretical, and face-based thought make the English-speaking people perfect sheep, basically. Now, I'm not denying that within the Confucian tradition you have all sorts of ways of making sure people conform with the larger community needs. I think the difference is that while Chinese people have learned they have to observe practices of ritual for their own overall community welfare, they, generally speaking, have also learned to think independently, but very discreetly. Now, of course, at times, end of empire times like you had in the late 18th century, that falls apart because China has been through a succession of imperial declines, but it always revives. And of course, that's what we've got today with the present government in China. Now, what you have today is not only the BRICS Pact, where these 5 countries have all got together and put in initially $200 billion a significant proportion of it from China, to set up 2 banks in Shanghai. But you also had taking place yesterday and the day before in Tajikistan, a meeting where the present 6 members of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement have agreed to provide new formula for new members to enter, which is expected to expand its membership by 4, bringing in India, Pakistan, Iran and Mongolia. Now that's a total population of around 3 billion people, but significantly it makes the international community, which we read so often about in English language media, a minority group, a minority declining group in the global community. And I would say the expansion of this has been brought forward considerably by Anglo-American misadventures in Ukraine. Now finally you've got the Eurasian trade zone, which is something that's talked about as a trade zone reaching from Vladivostok to Lisbon. This, I think, would not be a credible idea were it not for the success of China in building very fast trains like they built toys in the past. They churn these very fast trains out very, very quickly. You travel anywhere in China now, almost certainly on a very fast train, and what used to be a 6 or 7 hour ride now is almost a suburban train ride. And these very fast trains are starting to be planned or built across Siberia and throughout Central Asia, even down to Africa to some degree. Now this is transforming the Eurasian continent in a way that American strategists have long warned against. And it's restructuring fundamentally the global economy today. Now none of this, I believe, would happen were it not for the fact that you have very, very astute leaders, Confucian leaders in Beijing today. Although 2 of these initiatives have headquarters in Shanghai. So when we talk about Confucianism, we're not talking about something academic, something historical, something cultural. We're talking about the forces that are fundamentally shaping the world for all people today. And arguably will have a much more profound and wide-reaching impact than even the Anglo-American transformation of the last century or 2. And I think that's about all I have to say. But thank you very much.
But also, I think you're probably, from my point of view, you're probably a bit too pessimistic about the West and too optimistic about East. Okay, please bear with me with our last speaker this morning before we have some tea and then Q&A session. I'm going to introduce you Professor Yu De, who, as I said last night, actually was here talking about the comparison between Judaism and what can Chinese learn from Jewish. As a speaker for the Confucius Institute annual lecture, a very prestigious annual lecture. I'm telling you, if you don't know, we hold this every year. And last year it was given by a professor from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Professor Barry Saltman. And his topics are very provocative. And he said, the topic was, are China's ethnic policies better than that of the United States and India? And that title itself would make some people choke. The year before that, we had Professor Wang Xiaobong from Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he talked about democracy Chinese style. And of course, we all know China has no democracy, right? But he was talking about democracy Chinese style. And before that, we had Professor Wang Fei from China, talking about Tibetan question between East and West. And so, next year, we'll find another speaker. Now, today, Professor Yu Fu has a bachelor degree and a master's degrees from Shandong University, where he works now, and he has a PhD degree from Peking University in philosophy. And Professor Fu established the Research Institute of Jewish Culture at the University of Shandong, and now is the director of the Center for Judaic and Interreligious Studies of Shandong University, the director of the Department of Philosophy in Philosophy Social Development College, and a distinguished Yangtze River scholar and a distinguished Mount Tai scholar. And Professor Fu's main areas of research include Jewish philosophy and religion, comparative religion and philosophy, foreign philosophy, and ancient Western philosophy. And today's topic is filial piety in Confucianism and Judaism. Now, I teach students Chinese culture and language. Every time I ask the students, Australian students, do you know what filial piety is? Lots of them don't know the word, let alone the meaning of it. So let's welcome Professor Fu to enlighten us what filial piety is. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gao, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just as mentioned by Professor Gao, that yesterday evening I gave a talk about Confucianism and Judaism. I mentioned the core value, Confucian values, including 仁义、礼、智、信, 孝道, and some others. Today I'm going to focus on filial piety in ancient Judaism and Confucianism. Not to save time, I want to just read the article. Since preaching that filial piety as a virtue has been highly advocated by Confucianism, in biblical Judaism, filial conduct is also an important commandment and virtue. My presentation is to compare virtue of filial piety in ancient Judaism and early Confucianism. By ancient Judaism, I limited it to the biblical Judaism and Judaism in Talmud. And by early Confucianism, I defined it in the period of Trajan dynasty and the early period of Han dynasty. The first part will expound the connotation of filial piety and to explore the similarities of the concept in both ancient Judaism and Confucianism. The second part will reveal the main differences on filial piety in the two religions. The third part will try to find out why the similarities and differences of filial piety exist in Confucianism and Judaism. Now, part 1, filial piety, connotation and similarities. The fundamental meaning of Confucian filial piety is yang and jing. Yang means material support of parents. Confucius thought that only supporting parents with food and clothes is far away from the true filial piety. For him, the core filial piety is jing, which means to respect, love, and revere or fear parents. As he said, even dogs and horses likewise are able to do something in the way of support. Without reverence, how can we distinguish the real filial piety from the other? He regarded reverence as the criterion to distinguish human beings from animals. Zhengzi, his disciple, inherited Confucius' idea and went even further and viewed reverence to parents as the highest level of filial piety. Judaism also advocates filial conduct to their parents, and the fundamental meaning of filial piety is also material support and reverence. In the Hebrew Bible, we read, "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." In this commandment, the Hebrew word for honor is kabbat, which means honor, respect, and glory. In another verse from the Bible, we read, "Each of you must respect his mother and father." The root of the word here is ira, which means fear or revere. In Talmud, a rabbi distinguished the fear from honor with some specific cases. In short, in Rabbinic Judaism, honor parents has two folds of meaning: material support and psychological spiritual reverence. Confucian filial piety is also embodied by li, right, or propriety. The Book of Rights formulates detailed rules on how a son and his wife should serve their parents and relatives. They should immediately respond and reverently proceed to do it in going forwards or backwards or turning round. They should be careful and grave. While going out or coming in, while bowing or walking, they should not presume to sneeze, cough, yawn, or stretch themselves, to stand on one foot, to lean against anything, to look askance. They should not dare to spit or snaggle, nor, if it be cold, to put on more clothes, nor, if they itch anywhere, to scratch themselves. Regarding how to respect and revere parents, there are also vivid stories in Judaism. As mentioned in the Talmud, there is a filial son named Dama, son of Nethinah. He had opportunity to make a trade and could earn 60,000 gold coins. But his key was under his father's pillow. His father was sleeping. In order not to disturb his father's rest, he gave up the deal. The story tells that in Judaism, children's filial conduct, his father is dead. Filial piety in Judaism also contains the same meaning. A rabbi taught that he must honor him, his father, in life and must honor him in death. In both early Judaism and Confucianism, filial conduct should be carried out through life and afterlife. Confucius said parents, when alive, are served according to propriety, that even dead, they should be buried according to propriety, and that they should be sacrificed according to propriety. In other words, filial sons should respect their parents according to propriety after death, as they were still alive. Second part, filial piety, differences. The differences are mainly concerned with the following three aspects: the reverential extent of filial conduct, the range of filial ethic, and the status of filial piety in each system. The differences in reverential extent of filial conduct firstly lies in the support of parents. Confucian filial piety is not limited to material support of parents. Instead, it reaches such an extent as to make parents joyful. Confucianism demands the young people to care about their parents with the work and supply them with the food and drink. Surely, these conducts are manifestations of filial piety, yet they are not enough. The true filial piety requires the children to do so nice as to make parents joyful all the time. It is clear that in Confucianism, support is not only to provide food and clothes, but also to make parents delighted psychologically all the time. Similar saying can be seen in the Bible. May your father and mother be glad. May she will give you birth, rejoice. However, such teaching is quite rare, and there's no details on how to make parents delighted in the Bible. On the degree of supporting parents, Judaism has not yet reached the Confucian extent, that is, to make parents joyful all the time. In addition, it is said in Confucianism, while his parents are alive, the son may not go abroad to a distance. If he does go abroad, he must have a fixed place to which he goes. Another distinction is more important. Confucian filial piety was extended from the initial filial ethic to the range of a whole society. It is a tier, fraternal duty, while filial piety was spread to brothers, Zunzun respecting the elders, while to the aged, and transform filial piety into loyalty to the rulers. According to Confucianism, as long as people learn how to do filial piety, the whole society would be harmonious. Loving father, 父慈, filial son, 子孝, friendly elder brother, 兄友, respectful younger brother, 弟恭, honorable monarch or ruler, 君惠, loyal minister, 臣忠. The idea to rule a country with the filial piety, which was originated from the book of filial piety, was widely accepted and used by subsequent dynasties. Now let's look at the status of filial piety in Judaism and Confucianism. In Confucianism, filial piety is regarded as the first virtue. The analect tells us the superior man bends his attention to what it is radical. That being established, all practical causes naturally grow up. Filial piety and the fraternal submission, 孝悌, are they not the root of all benevolent actions? In Confucian view, 人, humanness, is the essence of human being. Being human is to fulfill the inner humanness in daily life. That is to practice humanness. The top priority of the practice humanness is to follow the way of filial piety and the fraternal duty. There are similar words in the book of filial piety. Filial piety is the root of all virtue, and the stem out of which grows all moral teaching. Differently, in Judaism, respecting parents is absolutely important, but it's not the essence of a human being, yet not the first virtue. As I mentioned earlier, in Judaism, honor thy father and thy mother is the fifth of the 10 Commandments. The first 4 commandments among the 10 commandments are concerned with the relationship between God and man and constitute the first part of the dialogue. The other 6 commandments, which form the second part of the decalogue, are about the relationship between man and man. Keeping the order of the 10 commandments in mind, we can see the filial piety belongs to the second part of the decalogue, and its position is secondary to the commandments about the relation between God and man. Therefore, theologically speaking, honoring parents is secondary in importance while being compared with worship of God. Rabbinic Judaism more values the filial piety to parents than biblical Judaism. The Talmud calls God, Father, and Mother 3 honorable partners of children. However, although parents and God are both the objects for children to respect and fear, their status is different. God is always in a position of priority because both children and their parents should worship God. Yet, Jewish people honor and fear parents, but not worship parents. They only worship God. Worship is above honor and fear. Worship includes honor and fear, and the degree of level of piety of worshiping God is much higher than honoring parents. As a typical monotheism, Judaism worships only God. When some rabbi claimed honor parents or viewed both God and parents as honorable partners, it doesn't mean to worship parents like God. The third part, why similarities and differences? Now, why do Judaism and Confucianism both advocate the ethic of filial piety? Why did ancient Judaism not emphasize filial piety to the extent as the Confucianism did? Why does filial piety occupy the place of the first virtue in Confucianism whom the Jewish people could worship? Second, it is a revealed religion, believing that prophets received and transmitted God's message. Torah is the record of the words that God talked to Moses. Third, it believes that the Jewish people are the chosen people of God, and they, as the chosen people, could communicate with God through sacrifices and prayers. Fourth, it believes that the purpose of Jewish life is to be a righteous person by doing good deeds in accordance with the law. Fifth, it believes that human beings were created in God's image, so everybody is born equal in dignity and personality. Sixth, it believes that the law covers all aspects of human life, and therefore the life guided by the law would be sanctified. All these points show that Judaism is a theocentric religion. Those features of Judaism are related with its concept of filial piety and distinguish it from that in Confucianism. Above all, now that God is the core of Judaism and the only worshipped by Jewish people, the parents are not viewed as the centrality and therefore expelled from the objects of worship. That is to say, in ancient Judaism, the people could at most honor and fear their parents, but not worship them as they do with God. In Confucianism, however, Chinese people would worship their living parents and deceased ancestors who have been transformed into spirits. Secondly, if the Jews worship anything besides God, including their parents, no matter if their parents are alive or dead, they violate the commandment. You shall not make and worship idol. That's the second commandment in the 10 in the Decalogue. Idolatry was seriously prohibited, the example of which could be easily found in the Bible. Like in Exodus 32, we could see after Moses led the Israelites left Egypt and wandered in the desert, how he waged a desperate campaign against idol worship. Thirdly, all men were created by God, as it is said that God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created man, male and female, he created them. Genesis 1:26, 1:27. So, all people were equal in dignity before God. In this sense, children and parents are also equal. The spirit of equality has considerably impacted Jewish people. Thus, while serving the parents, they must not be conscious of a hierarchy and they are lower than their parents. Whereas in Confucianism, the idea of hierarchy and the children's lower status is always emphasized. Because of the spirit of equality and dignity, the Jewish people do not have to look up to and fear their parents so much as the Confucian classic text indicated. Fourthly, now that God is the core of Judaism and the parents are secondary to him in status, it is natural that filial piety to parents would certainly become secondary to worship of God. Therefore, Jewish people, while offering parents accommodation and services, they do not have to reach the degree that the Confucian disciples require them to reach. As mentioned above, early Confucianism demanded a son to manifest the utmost reverence in his nourishing of them. His endeavor is going to give them the utmost pleasure. Fifthly, if God is the only worshipped,
Yeah, even it's so beautiful outside, and you have the patience to stay with us. Now the floor is open. You could make a comment or ask questions to any of our speakers, but please do be precise and don't make too long comments. Okay? Because we need to give everybody a chance. So, please.
都可以。
都可以。好，那我用中文问，就是有关于就是刚才就关于对现代读经的问题。读经现在在中国已经成为一种潮流，尤其是让4、5岁的孩子就开始读经。我就想请问各位，这种让在现代中国社会让4、5岁读经的4、5岁的孩子读经是否合适？如果合适，为什么有哪些好处？如果不合适，那么怎么才能够正确的读经呢？
Nowadays, it is quite popular for the Chinese parents to ask the toddlers and young kids aged 4 to 5 to read these traditional Chinese classic books. Do you think this is an appropriate practice for young kids? And how should we guide them to read traditional Chinese classics?
And also, if it is appropriate, why it is appropriate? If it's not appropriate, why it's not appropriate? Perhaps I'll ask Rich to
I think it's very appropriate. I would love to find a way to have Australian English-speaking children wrote the classics from the age of 3. I'm presently exploring the possibility of developing a computer game where children at a very young age start playing this game and then discover they've learned significant portions of the Chinese classics. It's important, I think, you have to understand what the classics do to your thinking. And I didn't understand this until 2 years, well, no, I didn't understand it until probably about the last year. My experience 2 years ago at this Zihai Congress left me struggling to think what it did to a young mind to learn these classics. It was only when I started to think of the Lunyu, the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching all together, I realized that none of them are structured on rationality, none of them are structured on abstraction, none of them are structured on theory, and none on belief. These are the fundamentals of the Platonic tradition. And the fact that they don't do this means that from a very young age, children are taught to reflect and think for themselves. Now, that means they do the exact thing from that rote learning that the Western critics say they don't do. They say they just learn to recite. Quite the contrary. When it's the classics build into them at a very early age a need to think about all the aspects of their life experience. The Western education, on contrast, teaches you abstract, rational structures which can all lend to argument, which then deceive you into thinking this is thinking. It's not. And my conviction in this is reinforced by the fact that when I hear academics talk, I don't think they're addressing the real problems. When I hear politicians talk, and this is all in English, they're not addressing the real problems. They're formulating things in preconceived structures, just as George Orwell identified in 1984. Western thinking, contrary to its own self-promotion, is the thinking that is pre-programmed. And Chinese thinking, although it teaches you from historical experience to behave yourself, observe rituals, don't give away what you're thinking, teaches you to think. And so often you'll find Chinese in the West who've had substantial Western education fall into Western ways of thinking, criticize China. It seems to me that's very mistaken. And of course, it's only over the last less than a decade that you've had these schools in China with this rote thinking. So this has yet to make a major impact on China. I think, one more point, I think one would find too that even during the Cultural Revolution and subsequently prior to the revival of Confucianism, a lot of families still kept teaching their children the classics in the family environment from a very early age. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you're saying is probably quite shocking to some people.
Absolutely.
Because we in the Western think the Chinese are not creative, because they're good learning at the beginning as a student. They recite texts and they're not as innovative as Westerners, because Westerners are encouraged to think differently, don't recite things, don't good learning. And how about Roland? What do you think?
Well, as an academic, 2 points here. The claim by Western Europe to derive its traditions from ancient Greece is a very recent development. It actually really only happened properly in the 19th century. Before that time, there were some traditions, but before that time, particularly the Middle Ages, Western Europe knew it was very backward, and it looked to the East, in inverted commas. It looked to China, it looked to Egypt, it looked to India. Those places were regarded as ancient and as rich in traditions and rich in economic power and political power. Only when Western Europe started late in the scene to rise and take on that was there a shift. Up until that time, Greece was regarded as a copycat of older traditions. It was not regarded as very ancient, but as Europe started to see itself as dynamic, it needed something that was regarded as dynamic, and so Greece became appropriated as the origins of Western civilization. The strange thing is that if you look at the map of Europe, Greece is not in Western Europe. Greece is in Eastern Europe. It's part of the Balkans. There's more that I could say, that's enough.
That's good enough. Can I have another question? Yes, yes, you please. Yeah, with the glasses.
I think I want a response to an observation. As a former Freudian psychotherapist, I treated a number of Chinese patients over a relatively long period, and I was very struck by the similarities between the difficulties that I saw with them and the typical Jewish Holocaust survivor, including the numbers of generations. And the work was surprisingly frequently to do with things that had happened to their grandparents during the Japanese occupation, which left me with a sense that kind of historical trauma is presumably as pervasive amongst much of the Chinese population as it, one would think it would be amongst Jewish people. And historical trauma is, would seem to me, antithetical to harmony. What comments or reflections perhaps you have in relation to that?
Yeah, perhaps I could start with Professor Fu on that. The historical trauma of both Jewish people and the Chinese.
Thank you very much for the question. It is true that the Holocaust happened in Nazi Germany. 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And during the invasion of Japanese and many, I'm not so sure how many Chinese people lost their life. They were a tremendous trauma in the Chinese mind and the Jewish minds. How to treat the trauma? Some Jews, the Jewish experience inspired me. As I remember a great Jewish philosopher, Abraham Heschel. He was asked the same question about the Holocaust. He was a philosopher in 20th century, a well-known American Jewish leader, actually. And he answered the question in this way. Well, we're not eligible to forgive the Nazi Germany and especially the persons who killed the Jews in person, if we're not eligible because we are not the killed. If you ask somebody to forgive you, you ask the person, who were involved in the event. We are survivors. The history is past, and we have no qualification to forgive you. And I also remember somebody else say, okay, we preserve this historical experience, but we should look forward and to in the future. About the Chinese people, some Chinese scholars here, psychologically, of course, we have some kind of very bad remembrance of the past. Maybe because the Chinese people are hostile to Japanese, or the Japanese hostile to the Chinese. It seems to me we
should also remember the terrible past. I mean, the incident and the Holocaust in Nanjing, in Orshan, and we preserve this and learn lessons from this, the past, the bad past, and also look forward and to try to find some way to harmonize relation between the two peoples. Of course, the people, I don't think the people are bad, but the government, the high level of the society, they wage the war against China, not the government people. So nowadays we should pay attention to the other people to build good relation between the Chinese people and the Japanese people to make efforts to build a splendid future. So that's my understanding. Thank you.
Perhaps Professor Kung, you want to say something?
其实呢，中华民族是一个比较健忘的民族。
Actually, the Chinese nation, I would say, is a forgetful nation.
特别是对于别人的过失。
Especially regarding others' mistakes.
但是对别人的恩德是永远也不能忘掉的。
But we would always remember the benefits we have received.
这就是中国人的传统。
This is the Chinese tradition.
日本为什么会产生这个问题呢？就是日本人啊，他围攻中国的网，老是不断的在提醒中国人的，勾起中国人的记忆。
The trouble with the Japanese, with Japan is because they try to remind us of the past mistakes they have made and also the bad treatment we have received in the past.
最典型的就是靖国神社的问题。他在靖国神社里边呢，祭拜了7位，就是被那个国际法庭战后审判为定性为甲级罪犯的一些人的灵魂，这是中国人不能容忍的。
Especially the worship of war heroes. This is something that we cannot tolerate.
因为本来日本的天皇是要去，都是每年要去祭祀靖国神社的，就是因为这7名甲级战犯进去以后，天皇也不去了。
In the past, it was a common practice for people to go to the temples to memorize and worship the war heroes, especially those who have committed huge war crimes. But later, it was abandoned.
你祭祀对国家有贡献的人，这是无可厚非的。但是这些人，他对日本也许是，其实他对日本人没有功，他们把日本带上了战争的深渊，给日本人民也带来了很多的苦难。
It is understandable that they want to treasure their history, but actually, truth be told, these warriors didn't really bring any benefits to the Japanese people. It is simply wrong for them to celebrate the war crimes.
这些对中国人造成这么大的伤害的人，还在被日本祭祀，而且包括日本的总理大臣都会去这个祭祀的话，这中国人是无法理解的。当然，中国人也不会忘记的。
But however, in today's world, even important ministers in Japan and other cabinet members visit these war temples. This is something that we can't tolerate.
其实实际上，中日现在外交关系焦点就在这个靖国神社的这7个甲级罪犯身上。
Actually, this is the focal point of the conflict between Japan and China.
好，谢谢。
Thank you.
Okay, I take that as a comment. Maybe it's a bit far from the theme of today. Yes, the gentleman at the back, please. Yeah, you please. And with glasses.
Yes, yes.
No, sorry.
Oh my God!
No, that one is not. Yeah.
Okay, the first question, 不好意思，第一个问题是，请问清华简的出土对于上书赠委仪式有什么意义？对，更重要的是， 对于汉后的儒学发展有什么批判性的影响？第二个问题是从克己复礼到存天理灭人欲，并且西方也有一个禁欲主义，但是到了西方到了60年代中期之后，hippies 运动出现，然后到经济发展到现在，中国社会也出现了一种类似于 hippies 运动出现。请问如何用儒学来引导这种 hippies 运动，来以更加好的来引导年轻人进入一个积极向上的一个轨道？谢谢。
你好，请你重复一下第一个问题，可以吗？谢谢。
清华简的出土对于尚书的这个影响有什么影响
？Well, I will first. I have two questions. Actually, one of them is considers the guidance for hippies or youngsters. We know that in Western philosophy, there used to be a doctrine, this kind of aesthetic doctrine, which rings a bell for me because in Chinese traditional classics, we also treasure this philosophy of suppressing human desires and preserving the rules of God. So I'd like to know whether there is any indicative effects for Confucianism to guide today's youngsters.
All right. Okay. I think this is quite a tough question. Any speaker wants to do it? You want to do? You want to talk? Three of you? You want to do as well? Okay, right. So I start with because who wants to handle you first? Okay. Can you
short? Sure. Yeah. When I've spoken in China with people quite close to leadership, they see Confucianism as as probably the way to rein back. To be rich is good. Ethos of Deng's happy. That's Deng's job. China's become rich. It now has to go back to these other values. And I think the revival of Confucianism is substantially driven by that.
Yes.
The tradition in Christianity of this goes back to the 4th century. The monastic tradition with monasteries established. And a number of scholars have identified this as what is called Christian communism. It's a long history of Christian communism, where there's a rejection of wealth, material gain, and instead a focus on simple living, communal living, and having things in common.
Professor Fu, briefly.
I think first Yan can answer the question about the bamboo documents.
Okay.
青花简，到了20世纪末期到21世纪，好多地下的简帛突然涌现出来。对此事，我是抱有某种程度的怀疑。
The excavation of bamboo relics, whether they shed light on the study of Confucianism, I have doubts toward it.
大家都知道，除了就是郭店楚简，那是从坟墓来直接挖出来，无可置疑以外，像上海博物馆馆藏的，还有清华现在所馆藏的买回来这些简，都有点来路不明之嫌。
Except for those excavated from the ancient tombs, others exhibited in some museums in Shanghai and in Tsinghua, I really doubt the validity of the truth in it.
就是假定青花简是真的，也颠覆不了西汉以来的经学传统，尤其是尚书金运经学所奠定的对书学传统的这种颠覆，它也颠覆不了这个传统。
Even if there is some validity in these documents recorded in the bamboo relics, there's no way that they can shake the important status of traditional Chinese classics in Han Dynasty.
因为中国的经学就像西方的神学一样，它源远流长，它在不同的时代 会出现不同的理解和解释。这是中国学术发展像长江、黄河一样不断向前滚动的一个非常内在的价值支撑。所以，既然这个简帛它已经在两汉统一之前，后人读不到它，那么它对后人的影响几乎是没有的。
The traditional Chinese doctrines and theories are just like the Western theologian theories. They all have a very long history and was interpreted have varied interpretations. The spreading and interpretation of these doctrines are just like the flowing Yangtze River. They are of it is the spreading and interpretation are like in a dynamic process. That is why the interpretation and excavation and interpretation of such bamboo relics will only cause limited influence towards the interpretation of traditional philosophy.
所以我们既要重视对它的研究，同时也不要高估它的价值。
So on the one hand, we should really attach great importance to the study of such kind of bamboo relics, but on the other hand, there's no way that we shouldn't really overread such relics.
Okay, I think we should expand discussion. And also I would expand to the other gender. Because so far gentlemen asked questions, I want a woman question. I mean, yes, President. Yes.
您好吗？我很好，你呢？ My question is about the Chinese identity, and I thought that Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism makes up the Chinese identity. And if you take one out of the other, your identity is incomplete. Is it true?
Would like to answer that?
No. 中国构成中国人之所以为中国人身份的，是在于儒家，在于儒教，而不在于道教和佛教。当然，到了两宋以后，我们有儒释道三教合一，他们的三教合一的归向仍然是儒教，而不是佛教和道教。
Maybe it's a controversial to about where we can find our identity. It seems to me traditional Chinese culture can be the identity for modern Chinese. I mean, partly, as I mentioned yesterday, we should establish a new type of Chinese culture on the basis of the traditional Chinese culture, at the same time embrace Western modern values. Among the Chinese cultures, I mean, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, Confucianism was dominant in the long history of China. So even nowadays, Confucianism will play a more important role than Taoism and Buddhism. But anyway, all the three religions or three type of teachings are a part of Chinese culture. They can also play a role as Chinese identity. If some people can be Buddhists, they regard Buddhism as their identity. Some can be Taoists, they regard Taoism as their identity. But I believe in the future, many Chinese people will accept Confucianism, and they reshape the Confucianism, not the entire traditional Confucianism, to be their identity.
I would need to translate what Professor Yan has just said. Regarding to what constitutes the Chinese identity, I believe the essence lies in the Confucian thought and culture. Although back in Song Dynasty, there was this phenomenon of an integration of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. But I still believe that despite this integration, Confucianism still has the most prominent influence towards Chinese culture.
Okay, can I ask? Yes, please.
我想问3位中国来的教授，最近在中国有一位杨腾的学者，发表了一本著作是《上帝信仰在中国》，其中谈到了儒家思想跟宗教的关系。他的观点基本是这样子的，他认为孔子并没有否定天的概念以及上帝的概念，他是一个基督徒的作者，但是这本书引起了一些争议就是国内学者争议，特别是新儒家学者争议。我想问3位教授，你们的观点是什么？在儒家思想发展到现代社会的今天，现在中国社会的今天，有没有必要引进上帝观念、上帝思想？第二个是在历史上有一些儒家学者以及最近的新儒家学者，他们都提到了。
Can I just interpret the first question first?
Okay.
Thank you. There is one Chinese scholar who has published some works on the relationship between the belief in God and Confucianism. According to him, Confucius actually had denied the existence of God and Jesus Christ. His works has instigated a lot of controversy among scholars, especially Neo-Confucianism scholars. So I'd like to know whether in the future dissemination of Confucianism, whether we should introduce and merge the concept of God with Confucianism and what impact it would cause towards the future dissemination of Confucianism.
Let me ask this one question. Okay. So the question is, do you think is it possible or is likely to have a God in Confucianism?
Okay. I think it's possible and acceptable to have an idea in the current and the future Chinese culture. In the past decade, a group of Chinese scholars advocate Confucianism as a religion. Of course, as a religion, Confucianism must be based upon heaven as God, as deity. It is true, we can find evidences from the book of poetry, book of the documents, and from analects of Confucius. There's so many verses and the sentences about heaven as God. 天生正明，有物有则，为天为大，天生得律育，君子不知命，无以问君子，天命的。So many expressions about heaven as a deity, and the ancient Chinese worship of heaven. Of course, in ancient China, only to the main states, but I concerned, only the emperor was eligible, qualified to worship heaven. The common people was not entitled to worship heaven. But after that, even nowadays, the ordinary Chinese people can also worship heaven. Well, when I spend the Chinese New Year, Chinese New Year, and we also worship heaven, and of course also worship the deceased ancestors. So I think two important concepts in Chinese culture. First of all, heaven as a deity. Secondly, the deceased ancestors, and they were the objects of worship. Well, in the history, I think after the Han Dynasty, especially the Song and the Ming dynasties and the New Confucian philosophers, pay more attention to heaven as some kind of Tianli, make them to very, very philosophical, very rationalized, and gradually lost the nature of deity. But I think nowadays we need a religion. As Western people, Christianity was dominant, and the Jewish people, Judaism was dominant. In China today, we also need some religions, including Confucianism as a religion. To build this religion will help you, to get some kind of deity as the basis of the religion. So I agree that 10 deceased ancestors could play a role as the object of worship. So generally speaking, I agree and accept this idea.
Okay, this is very important because you introduced the concept of Tian heaven, right? But whether Tian is God or an abstract God, whether it's God in Confucianism, most people think Confucianism is not religion at all. Right? But now what is religion and what is God in it? So yes, can you want to say something?
Just very briefly, one of the problems with the term religion, which we continue to use, is that it was the basis of Christianity. So the model of a religion was based on a Christian understanding. And a lot of work has been done to question that origin, and particularly the idea that religion has to have a God. It's not necessary for religion to have a God within the system. So this is a lot of work has been done.
That's good, thank you. I would like to word from Professor Cook. Now, you're descendants of Confucius. Now, you can tell us what Confucius thinks. 在孔学里面有没有可能有上帝？
孔子说是这个孔子弟子记载是子不语怪力乱神，孔子是不讲什么神的。
Actually, the disciples of Confucius said that Confucius doesn't talk about ghosts or God or any other spirits.
孔子的弟子问孔子这个怎么去奉祀神，孔子说：“我奉祀人我还没学会呢。”他不去那个，怎么能去奉祀神啊？所以孔子不主张去奉祀神。其实孔子是不信神的。
The disciple asked, "Who should I worship?" Confucius answered that, if one hasn't even learned how to respect people, how should one learn how to worship God? That's why the Confucius doesn't worship any spirits.
孔子呢讲天，但是他的天呢和宗教天不一样，宗教的天主是某一个人，而中国的天是一个自然的现象、自然的规律。
The Confucius talks about heaven rather than God. God is personified, while heaven is something related to the nature.
因为中国人的宗教观念都非常大，这受了孔子的影响。
That is why the Chinese people today doesn't have a strong religious belief. This is probably one of the legacies of Confucianism.
中国人说嘛，平时不烧香，事来才报佛教。家里有了病人了，有了困难了，他才去到庙里去祭祀，去祷告。
The Chinese people normally only visit the temples and pray to God only when they suffer from troubles.
在神明面前，他说什么呢？如果是家里的病人好了，或者他转危为安了，他就是再修庙宇，重塑金身。
And when their troubles are solved, let's say their families are recovered from disease, then they will go back to the temple and express their gratitude towards the heaven.
我在这旁边讲什么呢？其实呢，我觉得他是对神的大不敬，在公开的贿赂神。
Actually, I think this is disrespectful heaven or God. It's actually a bribery.
所以中国人地上没有神，现在也没必要引个神进来，因为中国人不生活得很好嘛。
Therefore, I don't see there's a need to introduce the element of God into Confucianism because we don't have such a strong religious legacy.
我简单的，我回应一下，我既不同意副教授的观点，也不同意副教授的。孔子是讲，孔子不言怪力乱神， 不言乱神，乱神他是不言的，但是并不是说孔子不谈鬼神。
Actually, I disagree with the other speakers. Although Confucius said that I don't talk about ghosts, spirits, or other evil spirits, but actually Confucius was referring to evil spirits. That doesn't exclude his thinking or talking about spirits that are not evil.
大家都知道，诗书当中就有上帝，上帝是管天上的事情，这个人间还有一个地，这就是皇帝。中国人是把天上的事情和人间的事情分开。孔子在删诗书的时候，并没有把上帝废除。
Actually, with all this history of being an emperor, and the Chinese people never totally forsake the concept of God.
孔子说：“祭如在，祭神如神在。”
简短一点。
所以我刚才我也不同意傅教授的观点。其实祭天不仅仅是皇帝的事情，是每一个这个民族每一个分子的事情。我妈妈每年过春节的时候都要祭天。
That's why I disagree with Professor Fu. I don't think this is just the prince of the emperor's duty to worship God. It is the responsibility of every social members. Like, for example, my mom always go visit the temple in the Chinese New Year.
一句话，孔子说：“敬鬼神而远之。”这是最理性的一种反应。
Confucius has actually said to has actually advocated to respect spirits, but stay away from them.
Okay, that's good. Just one more question, because can humble, yes, please. Let you please.
I came relatively late to Confucius. I hadn't known much during my high school career. And I'm impressed by his structure of society and family, except for one thing which I cannot, and that may be because of my history, accept, and that is the concept of filial piety. Why? I was born in Germany during the period of the Third Reich, and once I grew up, I questioned the generation of my parents. I couldn't ask my father, he had died in the war and I don't remember him. But we asked questions and accused, and we saw that the older generation, the one we should revere, had made immense mistakes and brought a lot of misery in the world. So I can't accept the concept of filial piety towards my parents. And I rather follow the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was influenced strongly by Hegel and his concept of the world spirit, moving on higher and higher to better levels. And he said, in a spiritual or intellectual level, children do and should murder their parents. Would Confucius excuse my views?
Well, now, start from you, right? Philosophically.
You want me to answer that? I sometimes wish that my children, I have 4 and I have a grandson as well, had shown me more filial piety when they were growing up. Perhaps I can answer this in a different way. I speak a lot with young people in China. How do you manage the period of teenage rebellion? How is that managed in a different situation? And I'm told, I may be corrected, that it operates in a fashion that the parents know the children are doing what they should not do. And the children know that the parents know that they're doing what they should not do, but they don't mention it. It's realised that this happens and it continues with the pattern of filial piety, and at the same time they're allowed all sorts of ways of expressing themselves and becoming individuals. I don't know if that answers your question, but it seems to me at a very practical level it's a way of managing the transitions of life. So the children don't necessarily murder their parents.
Okay. Can I let you hear anything briefly before I get to Professor Fu?
Yes.
Yeah, but
It's a very challenging question. For your personal case, you don't think this is the right to respect your parents, and because your father passed away when you were young, you couldn't have any gratitude to your parents. But generally speaking, filial piety is based on blood, lineage, or kinship, and the close relation in the family relation, and the gratitude from the parents. So that is a rule, a general rule. I think it's to some extent it's universal, whether the people in the West or in China they accept the close relation between parents and the children. So I agree with the filial piety in Confucianism. Nowadays in China, the situation is very complex. I know filial piety have become a problem. The youngsters actually they don't respect their parents much, and even treated their parents. So that is why I'm working on some kind of Confucian religion in order to recall the filial piety and to establish a new concept of filial piety for the Chinese people, especially for the young Chinese people, to solve the moral problems. I think in the future, if we make a common effort, as Professor Yanning and some other Confucian scholars, we can restore the concept of filial piety, that more and more Chinese people, when they are in the cities or in the countryside, to practice filial piety. In this way, to keep the society in order, to restore a close relation between parents and the children.
Thank you, Professor Fu. I think we all know, I'm sure I know what answers from Professor King and Yang would be, so I'm not going to ask you. Right, okay. I prepared a whole page for concluding remarks, but I don't think we have time. Actually, my conclusion must be very, very interesting, but I don't have time to tell you. So let's welcome, thank you to all the speakers for today, and if you want to talk to them, you can talk to them afterwards. Thank you.